Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Paul Myers and I'm the Director of Research and Development at the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center, also known as the REMS TA Center. I would like to welcome you to the webinar, Planning to Recover from Emergencies at Districts and Schools. This webinar will provide information and lessons learned on recovering from emergencies with a focus on the 4 components of recovery for schools through several case studies. Participants will have an opportunity to pose questions to today's presenters, both in the question and answer session that follows immediately after the presentation section of the webinar, and also on the TA Center's Community of Practice, or COP, after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the REMS TA Center's website via our webinars page, along with an accompanying resource list and a copy of the slides following this event. You can find a link to our webinars page in the web links box on your screen. Before we start, we have a few brief housekeeping items to cover. The following tips will help ensure you are able to download files, hear the audio, request technical assistance, and ask questions during this event. So download any files from the presentation, use the downloads box on the right-hand side of your screen, select the name of the handout, and then click the download file button. This is where you will find a copy of the resource list for this presentation. As a reminder, there is no dial-in for this webinar. Audio is available via the link provided. If you're experiencing difficulty hearing the audio stream, please turn up your computer speaker volume at this time. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact the TA Center at info@remstacenter.org. You may also request technical assistance using the Q&A tool. Questions are viewable to the webinar moderator only. Finally, to ask a question for the question and answer portion of this webinar, use the Q&A tool on your screen to send your message to the facilitator. Questions will be answered in the order in which they appear, and as time permits following the presentation. If you would like to submit a question and are not able to do so via the box provided by Adobe Connect, please email your questions to info@remstacenter.org. Today we'll provide a brief introduction on recovery as well as its 4 components. Our guest presenters will then use several case studies of recent emergencies and disasters and will provide key considerations for recovery planning. Finally, at the end of this event, we'll have a short Q&A session which will continue in a web chat in our community of practice. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-presenters today. Madeline Sullivan is an Education Program Analyst in the Office of Safe and Healthy Students, or OSHS, at the U.S. Department of Education. She serves as Contracting Office Representative for the TA Center. Prior to joining the federal government workforce, Madeline provided technical assistance on pro-social skill development, violence prevention, and school emergency preparedness after having served as a special educator. Mike Dongan is the Program Supervisor for the School Safety Center of the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Olympia, Washington. He has taught at all levels and in different locations around the country and the world. Mike was with Seattle Public Schools for 30 years as a classroom teacher and program administrator, overseeing a variety of programs from ELL to technology, community technology, and bullying and harassment prevention and intervention. Mike was a 2008 recipient of the Spirit of Online Safety Leadership Award from Quest Communications and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Kristen Ashley is the Student Advocacy Coordinator at Norman High School in Norman Public Schools. In this role, she serves students who may be experiencing bullying, harassment, sexual assault, and other types of trauma. Before coming to Norman High School, she worked in elementary school counseling for 7 years. In addition, she is a licensed marital and family therapist in the state of Oklahoma. Amy Simpson is the principal at South Lake Elementary in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The Moore Public Schools District, a district with over 24,000 students, awarded Amy the responsibility to open South Lake Elementary 4 years ago. Prior to serving as the principal of South Lake, she spent 4 years as the principal at Plaza Towers Elementary. She has worked in education as an elementary teacher or administrator for the past 24 years. I'm the Director of Research and Development and support the field through activities such as the creation of resources, including the content of this webinar, trainings, and fact sheets, and by providing technical assistance. Before joining our team, I served the field of school preparedness as a police officer and for several non-government organizations or NGOs. The goal of recovery is to return the whole school community to a sense of normalcy after an emergency by working with community partners to restore educational programming, the physical environment, business operations, and emotional health and well-being of students, teachers, staff, and families. Effective recovery of a school community typically requires collaboration with community partners, such as the local emergency management office and other organizations such as NGOs and the private sector. This collaboration needs to occur before, during, and after an incident. Recovery activities and programs can also be built upon existing resources and supports already provided by schools. Recovery is related to the other 4 mission areas of prevention, protection, mitigation, and response. For more information on these 5 mission areas, you can access several TA Center resources, including an archived webinar titled Using the 5 Preparedness Missions to Help Ready Your District and School for Emergencies. Again, a link to the webinar's page is available in the web links box on your screen. Recovery activities can be conducted before, during, and after an incident or emergency. For example, before, planning for recovery should happen before an emergency occurs. Decisions that are made pre-disaster and in the beginning stages of recovery can significantly impact the nature, speed, and effectiveness of recovery efforts. During, as a school community responds to an incident, recovery activities can be initiated at the same time. And after an emergency, recovery activities can continue after the emergency and can last from hours to years. It's important to remember that recovery doesn't happen in one neatly defined phase. The type and breadth of recovery efforts required of a school or district will likely depend on the size and scope of the emergency. You'll hear more about the different timeframes of recovery from our presenters later in the webinar. I'm now going to hand things over to Madeline, who will discuss the recovery components. Madeline?
Thank you, Paul. To help identify all the activities that schools and school districts may need to conduct after an incident, it's helpful to consider it in 4 categories. So it's helpful to split recovery into the components of academics, physical and structural, business functions, and social, emotional, and behavioral recovery. So academic recovery is the resumption of teaching and learning. Physical and structural recovery involves the repair and restoration of buildings and supplies. Business function recovery returns business operations and all of those important functions that folks do behind the scenes of teaching and learning back to those normal levels. Social, emotional, and behavioral recovery provides support to students, teachers, staff, and everybody at the school and school district to help return their lives to a sense of normalcy and build some coping skills. So the 4 recovery components may progress at different rates. For example, physical and structural recovery may only take a few days after an event, but those social, emotional, and behavioral recovery aspects may take months or sometimes even years. So with academics being the first component, we know that learning is a primary purpose of schools, or it's the mission of schools. And that ability to resume academic activities is essential to a school's recovery. So the resumption of academic activities begins also to help restore that sense of normalcy, or the new normalcy, to the school environment, which is critical to the social, emotional, and behavioral health of students and staff. So typically schools have several options to continue education. Continuing classes in a different location, allowing distance learning, or even blended learning that combines online and independent learning and traditional teaching strategies. Whatever is employed, schools and districts must ensure that assessments are conducted to ensure that learning goals have been and are continuing to be achieved. So after an emergency, adjustments may be needed to the academic routine, such as sharing classrooms or dividing up the class day, and sometimes reevaluating that curriculum. And also for those longer term recovery efforts when it comes to it, there are other options to consider, such as integrating students with other schools and school districts. As for physical and structural, this recovery is needed to support education as well, and this involves the restoration of a school's buildings, equipment, and supplies. So after an incident, you may need to, well, when you're planning for recovery after an incident, you need to consider things such as assessment and repair of the structural and physical damage, things like cleaning the facilities as well, and removal of all of those health and safety hazards. You're also going to be putting in place some plans for coordinating donations and volunteers and getting new equipment and including things such as IT, your software, books, and instructional materials. There's also the consideration of those additional school supports and services that the schools and school districts provide, such as transportation and food service. And along with both of those, there's also a number of services that students receive at school, such as medical ones. So the third component to consider that's critical is the business functions. So the items that the school and school district need to be restored if impacted by an emergency. So when you're planning for after an incident, you want to be considering things such as will you have access to emergency funding to pay for that immediate cleanup and repair? How are you going to be working with IT and business services? Are there backups available? Restoration of things such as payroll, accounting, personnel records. Or these might, some of these you might want to be using an MOU or a pre-established vendor contract. And so then you also need to have some things in place to be ready to do some of those other efforts, such as registering those students into other districts if you need. So, and with that, you also want to have an opportunity or a tool for accessing the long-term efforts. And then the fourth component is the social, emotional, and behavioral recovery effort. So even though the academics have been, the opportunity to provide teaching and learning has been fully restored, and that physical and structural component is restored, and the business functions are all running smoothly, you need to ensure that the students and the staff are ready or accessible for teaching and learning, and that means addressing that social, emotional, and behavioral component of recovery. So this can continue for long periods of time after the event, and it also might vary from individual to individual. So for students, the emergency event may lead to some symptoms or some behaviors such as lack of engagement, whether that be socially or academically. In academics, we see that you're going to see a change in attendance, such as poor attendance, tardiness to classes, even incomplete assignments, as well as sometimes antisocial behavior and withdrawal. Every student shows it differently, but it's important to be looking for these kinds of behaviors that are indicative of a child needing more support or assistance. In the short and long term, additional activities may include referring students, teacher, and staff to long-term interventions, providing that trauma and grief and bereavement focused mental health support, and then monitoring attendance and grades and even visits to the counselor's or the nurse's office, as well as providing some training in care for caregivers to help prevent or reduce what's commonly referred to as compassion fatigue, or to state it in a positive, that resilience, and also considering providing such training for students and sometimes their families, depending upon the event. So information on how these activities, along with others, can be included in a recovery annex or a separate public health and medical and mental health activity. We have a number of resources. But one item that you all should keep in mind is planning for spontaneous memorials, and you're going to be hearing more about that from our presenters. So I am going to hand things over now to Mike Donlin, and he's going to present some information on lessons learned about business functions and recovery as it relates to social, emotional, and behavioral recovery. So Mike?
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. I appreciate that. Again, I'm Mike Donlin from the state of Washington, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction here in Olympia, Washington. And kind of reiterating everything Amy said, what we have learned, one of the biggest learnings is that we can't prevent everything. And as we go through all the steps of prevention, mitigation, protection, response, and recovery, the recovery part is that one that's often the one that's least acknowledged, we're least prepared for. And so what I'm going to do is walk through 3 situations that we in the state of Washington experienced in the course of a 7-month period in 2014. Each one's a little bit different, and as we walk through those, I'll explain the situation, and then we'll eventually talk about the social, emotional, and the business learnings that came out of that. The first one is the landslide. Interestingly enough, this happened on a Saturday, not on a school day, and it happened in a small rural community which did not have a school nor a school district. However, the impact of this was devastating in that the people who lived in the community, 42 people died, and some of those were school children. Those kids attended school in 2 separate districts, and that was an impact on not 1 but 2 districts. One of the pieces of the action that came out of this was that the landslide itself destroyed the only road through town. And so to get the kids to school for the coming school year, for the rest of the school year, was a major effort in that those kids had to go through all kinds of back roads and up around the hills to get to one or the other of the school districts. And again, piggybacking off what Amy mentioned, sometimes those kids went to a different school district because of where they were able to reach. One of the things that happened here in this situation, though, was the learning was that nobody had the emergency contact information for superintendents of the 2 school districts, their personal contact information, during the course of a weekend when school was not in session. So that was one of those learnings that we decided, we realized there had to be a better long-term communication system, long-term communication plan in the systems. Now, the second situation happened in the summer of that same year. People often think of Washington as being the place where it rains all the time, except it doesn't. And in the summertime, it's very, very dry. And again, as this year, in summer of 2014, there was a series of wildfires that ran through central and eastern Washington. One of the results of this is a piece of legislation which we call here House Bill 1003. But bottom line for schools and for school districts in planning for emergencies, what happened here was in the small community of Palouse, where there are only 650 people approximately in one school building, that school building was severely damaged, and it had to be reinstated and recovered, brought back to a sense of normalcy, to usability, before the beginning of the school year. So the question of how to do that and how the funding was going to come is one of those response and recovery questions that we dealt with and learned. I'll talk a bit more about that House Bill 1003 as we move forward here. Finally, this picture does not represent the shooting at the school, the tragedy. This picture represents pastoral Washington, the beautiful countryside, which we call the Palouse. And as it turned out, on October 24th, 2014, I happened to be in a car with several other dads who were traveling across the state to Washington State University when this situation arose. My phone blew up in the car, and I began to get calls from people all over the state wondering what's happening next. Did you hear this? Did you see that? That will also feed into some of the learnings we had around social media. But the event itself was one of those major tragedies that happens in a school, in a district, in our country. As it turned out on that day, that Friday, a young student, a 15-year-old at a high school, pulled out a gun and killed 4 of his friends and himself. Now, these were not just friends, they were family members as well. This, the learning that comes from this in terms of long-term recovery is incredible. Just to underscore some of those things that Amy mentioned before, this was October 2014. The cafeteria in which this took place in the building did not reopen until a new one was built, and it just opened in January of 2017. So again, remembering the prevention, mitigation, protection, response, and recovery, and that we can't prevent everything, let's see what some of those things are that we did learn. Amy mentioned spontaneous memorials, and this picture here represents one of those kinds of spontaneous memorials. We've seen them along the highways and so forth. This one was on a fence outside of the Marysville-Pilchuck High School where the shooting took place. It's just a reminder, the picture here is a reminder for some of those things that we need to consider. And again, in talking about the physical, psychological, emotional, business, academic pieces, components of recovery, those pieces of recovery do impact students and staff, families, community partners. They impact everyone. And again, oftentimes take quite a bit of time. Some of the things that we learned, some of those things that we had not really given too much thought to in terms of response and recovery, part of it, I'm going to back up a little bit here, we realize that response and recovery are joined at the hip. They're very, very closely related. And in preparing for response, we are beginning to prepare for recovery. The process of recovery is fulfilling out our plan in response for the longer term. There are kinds of things that we look at here, the stuff of response and recovery, the kinds of situations that arise in communities with gridlock from traffic, dealing with multiple jurisdictions who come to an event, who respond to an event, all sorts of donations that pour into the school, the community, that the school and the district and the community then has to figure out what do you do with these things, like how do you handle 15,000 teddy bears that are poured in because they're meant to be gifts for the young folks in the building. Lots of people want to volunteer. Who's going to coordinate those efforts? And then again, those spontaneous memorials. We pictured the one on the fence. Reality of 21st century life is that many of these memorials are going to also be online, which makes it much more difficult. But how do you handle them? Preparing for this possibility, how do you handle them? How do you take them down? How do you move them? On the other side of the coin, when we're looking at a little bit more on the recovery than the response, the process of dealing with funerals and memorial services of lost lives is something we don't want to think about, but it's part of our recovery process. As Amy mentioned and Paul mentioned, those government and agency partnerships that we have, all those things that are there for us if we have planned to use them wisely and use them well. I'll talk a bit more about school staff and staffing traumas and so forth in a bit. And then we'll hit the return, the continuity of operations plan and talk a bit about that in terms of long-term recovery. The social, emotional, behavioral recovery on the human side of things is, again, bottom line, a long-term process. Long-term process. We expect our staff, our administrators, to be there for the kids, and sometimes those people are experiencing the same, if not more so, the same kinds of trauma as the students. Building this into the long-term planning process, putting things in place as the prevention, mitigation, protection part, and then realizing that when it gets to response and recovery, this is where this is critically important. One of the pieces of the learnings, one of the learnings that has come out of all of this is that as long as this is fresh news, if you will, and the media is there, things are on the headlines, things are on the front burners. When the media leaves, when things die down after a week, after a couple of weeks, then your staff, your school, if you will, are left on their own to serve their own devices. So how do we prepare them to go the long haul? Mentioned this earlier on, as a result of the Palouse fires, the state legislature in Washington passed House Bill 1003, which is a bill concerning the development of a model policy on natural disaster school infrastructure recovery. There are a couple of things in here. I'm not going to read the whole bit, but as Paul was talking earlier on, the idea of knowing who your partners are, knowing where the funding sources are, planning for those kinds of things up front is critical. And it's one of those things where the realization, it's better to prepare up front, obviously, than to find out at the end that you don't just go and ask for money, that there are processes in place. And there are processes in place at the local level, local through state through the governor, the emergency management department, moving on through federal dollars. So it's critical to have in place the who's on first, of who are the people we need to contact, how do we contact those people, what do we need to do to begin to get dollars to do some of the recovery that is critically important. And some of this we built into your COOP plan. Washington State has a definition for continuity of operations, and it basically requires that state agencies and public agencies have continuity of operations plans. We know in reality that school districts very often do not have what is really a continuity of operations plan. Continuity of operations plan built into your EOP emergency plan, the continuity of operations plan would be one of those functional annexes for the particularly at the district level, which deals with bringing yourself back to a sense of normalcy as much as possible, kicking it in within a few hours of the event and lasting up to 30 days, even longer at some points in time. The components of a continuity of operation plan can be very difficult for people to consider, to look at. What are the essential functions of a school district? And to really consider this and plan for the essential functions and going down through, if something were to happen to the superintendent or the board or the central office administrators, who would pick up the slack? Who's on first to follow those people up? Where are your vital records? Where are they housed? Where do they sit? Are they hard copies or are they digital virtual copies? What do you have and how do you access those? If your central office headquarters or a building is completely destroyed, where do you go next? Do you have things in place, those MOUs that were alluded to earlier? Do you have the MOUs in place to say we will move our functions to this other building in another district, another town, another place? The whole idea of devolution. What if your central office administration is no longer available at all? What happens next? Where do people go? And then how do you bring yourself back to normalcy post the event? Long, detailed, difficult questions for a continuity of operations plan. One of the things that we learned quite critically and very importantly is that in this 21st century, it's a different world, and we need to build social media into our planning process. On the upside, there's a lot more communication that takes place and a lot more ways to communicate via social media. Situational awareness can potentially be increased. Communication can be increased. On the downside, much of the social media that people use is outside of the school district, and we have no control over the validity of things that are passed back and forth from one to the other. Another piece of learning that came out of all of the events is that, well, we know this, not everyone is equally social media savvy, thank you. And not everyone has access to the same kinds of or the same personal technologies. And on the ugly side of things, in almost any given situation, what we need to plan for, which we hardly ever think about doing, but we need to plan for those folks who are just going to be out to troll. We need to plan for misinformation, too much information, badly timed information, things that don't come from our identified chief information officer, your media relations person. So make sure that person is on board and knows what to do and what to do next. The critically important parts: build the use of social media into your emergency operations and safety plan. the communications, the stuff that comes in, who will vet things, who will share things, as much as possible, pre-script, and build, if you can, build, if you will, a silent, a black website that can be popped up when the need arises for immediate, critical, verifiable information. Make sure everyone knows who the CIO is in your organization, in your district, in your schools, and work with your local social media. Work with your local media so they don't jump out ahead of things and share information which is incorrect. In closing, again, in terms of recovery, planning is critical. Know your resources and where to get them. Work with your staff, train them, and realize that recovery takes time. It may take years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. As a friendly reminder to everybody, if you'd like to ask Mike any questions about his presentations, please submit them in the Q&A box. I'd now like to hand things over to Kristen and Amy, who will discuss the lessons learned about academics recovery and physical and structural recovery. So Kristen, over to you.
Thank you. We're going to first set the stage for our case study. Our school, Plaza Towers Elementary, was hit by a tornado on May 20th, 2013. It was an EF5 tornado, which is the strongest tornado on record. In our district, 2 elementary schools were completely destroyed. 1 junior high was a partial loss, and the administration building was also a partial loss. At our school, we had 7 student deaths within our building. This is our building the night before the tornado, a picture of our school. And this is our building the day after the tornado, probably a few hours after the tornado to be more specific. So we're going to start in talking about academic. The location accommodations that have to be met after the recovery of a tornado, there are immediate ones, obviously, and short-term ones. So I'm going to speak on the immediate ones being within a couple minutes from recovery, we had to find a safe place to gather so that parents could come find students and teachers could gather all their students to see who was there. We used a church nearby or a parking lot that was clean. Obviously, we had a different kind of experience because we weren't just evacuating our building, but we were needing to evacuate the neighborhood we were in. Also, a couple days after the tornado, our tornado being in May 20th, it was the Monday of the last week of school, but we needed to have a faculty and staff meeting for the entire district. We met in a large church within the Moore community. So utilizing those resources around you is very important. And also the third day after the tornado, we wanted to make sure students had a place where they could come see each other and also see their teachers. When you end in a disaster situation like that, you end a day and you also end a school year, it's very important social emotionally for students to find each other and also just to reconnect. So we met at a nearby school that could accommodate both Plaza Towers and their school. And it was close enough to the neighborhood that was hit by the tornado because transportation was difficult for people because cars were lost during the disaster as well. And during that time, using the alternative communication methods to disseminate the information was very important. We used social media and news outlets because people did lose a lot of access to their cell phones and other types of communication because it was a widespread disaster. In the short term, as far as location and getting our students and staff together, the community hosted several events during the summer months. The end of May is the end of our school year. So between June and July and the early part of August, we had various community-hosted events where we passed out new backpacks to students, had just fun with them. We met at a local water park, etc. During that time, we utilized buildings within the district to have our district counseling events. It was very important to the district administrators and to myself and our staff that we get some counseling on how to better cope with the trauma that we have gone through, and then how to help students cope with it also. That following school year, we went into a pre-existing school building with the appropriate accommodations. So we had a junior high that had the least amount of students in it, and we were housed in one of their extra buildings. They had a separate building, and we called ourselves Plaza 800 at that time, and the district operations and maintenance department outfitted that building to accommodate elementary students. In addition to being at the junior high, right next door was an elementary school where we were able to use their facilities that would better accommodate like the playground and the library. When talking about the scheduling process, immediately, as I just spoke, our 2012-2013 school year was immediately canceled. With only 3 days after the tornado for school, the State Department of Education in Oklahoma did give us approval. We had finished all of our benchmarking exams, state mandatory tests, and all types of accommodations could be made for our students to receive their end of the year report cards and stuff like that. In the short term and in the long term, our regular school hours were utilized. We are a 9:15 to 3:45 school time, and that helped with busing so that we also didn't interrupt the flow of traffic for the junior high that met in the same area. We also would have an assembly schedule. Whenever you go through a tragedy of any kind, the outpouring from the community is huge, and they are wanting to come to your school and present you with items or do some kind of motivational speaking or even some counseling sessions, some art therapy. So we had an assembly schedule too that we utilized that allowed us to have assemblies come through, but it still allowed for the regular curriculum to be taught without being interrupted. We were very flexible with the donor services. People would visit our school throughout the entire school year following the tornado, and we allowed them to come in and out as they needed, and we accommodated anyone who would like to visit with us or see our facilities. The other thing is we're accommodating the weather-related concerns. With scheduling, you have to be flexible. Anytime that students or parents felt anxiety about the weather, we did allow for that school year to be excused absences if anyone felt as though they couldn't cope with the weather during school day. The parents were allowed to either not bring them at all, or they were allowed to check them out early. Our curriculum for the immediate and the short term, with the schedule of summer fast approaching, we did not have to be concerned about this, but we did want to make sure students received their report cards and their yearbooks at the end of the year. So a local organization hosted an event to make sure that all students received their report cards, yearbooks, and then actually also awards that they may have been given during the awards assembly that did not occur that year. Also curriculum, our teachers did the best that they could to present our past objectives, which are our Oklahoma objectives, and then also national objectives. Again, some of that would have been disrupted with assemblies. Even though you have the assembly schedule, things that came into play would be weather-related lessons. We taught more about the weather so that students would understand what was going on outside, what to expect when the weatherman said certain things on air. Students became very aware of weather reports, and we wanted to give them the best information they could. That is not necessarily an objective that is put out by the state or the nation as far as school-wide procedures, but that is something that our school needed. Another thing was the emotional and coping strategies. We had small groups, we had large groups, we had individual groups, and we had counselors within the school district, there's one elementary counselor in each building, but during the 13-14 school year, we had anywhere from 2 to 6 extra counselors in the building at all times. While we were recovering, immediately the district did the best that they could to salvage the records. We were not housing our records in a fireproof, waterproof safe. We had it in our office area, and so the district worked really hard to recover those, to dry them out, and to get copies made for other students who may be transferring to different districts, because families had to relocate and had to do that quickly throughout the summer. And so they worked really hard to get copies made of report cards or to print them new from the online server. So integrating students into Plaza Towers at our new location, we did bus the students from the original neighborhood. If part of the neighborhood did not sustain damage, so those families were allowed to get on buses and be bused about 1.5 miles to our new location. If a student had to leave the district, either somewhere within the more city limits, or if they were in Norman or a surrounding town, for that one school year, we allowed them to come back to Plaza Towers. We didn't want to create any more trauma than we wanted to keep them as close to us as possible and help them with everything along the way. And we believe that keeping them in Plaza Towers was the best thing for them. That only happened if the students' parents were able to transport them. We did not transport outside of the district back into the district. In addition to that, that's not on the slide here, something that Mike brought to my attention is we had backup servers built after the tornado. Because our administration building was hit, it did hit our backup servers. So when the district was rebuilding, they created a backup server on the opposite end of the district. And we're the 3rd largest district in the state. So that's currently at my building now, and I am approximately 10 miles from the other server. So they thought it was important to add that so that if one sustained damage, the other one could potentially save all of our data. Moving into the physical and structural component of recovery, the assessment and damage repair for a disaster at this level is pretty large. Communication between emergency responders and school administration. That lesson that we learned was very important, because when a disaster like this hits, you immediately go into response mode, but in the sense of several different emergency responders are coming into the building and taking care of things. And there's not necessarily always a central command center, but that's one of the lessons that we learned that would be very beneficial. And it would help with the flow of recovery. Immediately, we had people from all over the community and all over the neighborhood helping us. And quickly, we did have district administrators on location to help guide us. But that was one of the lessons that we really did have to learn to have a better plan in place for a recovery effort like this. 14 months later, the new building was completed. It did take the better part of 6 months just to make the decision that the entire slab, etc., had to be redone. So the building is in the same location, however, it is a whole new floor plan. On the structural, or the cleaning of the structural and physical recovery effort, you can see that these are 2 pictures of where we took shelter in the bathroom. There was debris everywhere, and so there was a small window of time to gather the things that you were allowed to go back to your room to get. The situation was quickly taken over by the National Guard and FEMA and other district officials, so it was just a quick moment that you could get things, but for the most part, we lost almost everything. Immediately after, the rubble was removed as needed to remove adults and kids out of the building. As you can see, the woman standing with the car in the background, that is our front office, just a few feet away from the bathroom that you saw previously. So a lot of the rubble was transitioned, I guess, in order to get people out of our safe areas. And then the picture with the two ladies, that's Kristen and I in that picture, and we were, that's the Sunday after, and you can see in the background that still there's debris that hasn't been removed. Everybody had to come in and make it official as far as it being a total loss before things were taken out. The volunteer and donation process is extremely giving and generous, and you want to do your best to respect all donations and volunteers. You know, the Red Cross is always very helpful, and organizing this can take quite the effort. District staff organize things immediately following. As you can see, the fence was put up by the National Guard to protect people from coming on site, but it immediately became a memorial with the loss of our students and other things. So independent donors also arranged their own donation process with teachers personally and other situations. In the long term, the district over the year and a half, almost 2 years, had a designated volunteer and donor coordinator. That person logged everything in so that it could be accounted for through our accounting department and then also through thank yous. And one of the things that surprised me was that and one of the things I learned is that there's a lot of emotional responses to donations, those who get the things and those who don't get the things. Then also, just on the donor side themselves, a lot of them have stories that they want to share. And to show the importance of them and your appreciation for them, I would meet several different people on weekends, during the night, in the morning, at various places because they would like to put a face with the person that they were giving to. Our final slide shows the restoration of equipment. We did not get to restore anything for the most part. The one thing we were able to keep and restore is that Panther wall that was in our building and became a symbol for our school when it was rebuilt to show the recovery process and the importance of sticking together as a school and a community.
Thank you, Kristen and Amy. We're now going to move into the penultimate part of this event with a question and answer session. As a reminder, to ask a question, use the Q&A tool on your screen to send your message to the facilitator. You can also email us at info@remcacenter.org. Questions will be answered in the order in which they appear and as time permits. So I'm looking here, and our first question, and Madeline, I think I'll ask you to answer this. So the question is, let's say that your library is destroyed, losing your book classification system, which isn't online, and losing many classics and historical archives. The question is, what would you do, and also what will be your priority in this situation of budget constraints? So Madeline, if you could answer those questions, please.
Yes, certainly, Paul. And then I am going to allow an opportunity for others to contribute as well. And then perhaps, Paul, you could mention one of our trainings. So this is a very important topic. And so what we recommend is that you address this with your community partners during the planning process. So you would identify these as an important asset, and you'd want to take steps to protect them. And using the before, during, and after paradigm, you take steps every day to protect them from harm and damage and even theft, as like from security protocols to taking steps to prevent moisture and things like that. So you're going to want to build off of these as you address the response and recovery. And sometimes your strategy might include coming up with an inventory of those items that must be removed and prioritizing them based on what needs to be removed first and why. So when there is an event that allows or comes with some advance warning, then you can take those steps. Or perhaps you store them in a place where they are most protected. So sometimes that's the interior of a building, sometimes it's the basement. It all varies. So I'm confident that there are other entities within your local community that have the same issue, and you could work together to come up with strategies. And then when I mentioned inventory, this is very important, whether it's the library, the business office, or the classrooms. I encourage everyone to consider creating a process for having a constant, up-to-date set or inventory of sorts. So oftentimes people do inventories of items like classroom desks and chairs, excuse me, and how many are needed for the new academic school year. So if this could be kept in a centralized place and have a column stating the last day it was updated, it could be known by those who need to know it. And then as the classroom teachers update the number of textbooks and such and so on, that way, if ever there was an emergency or disaster, you would have that current inventory. And this is really important for insurance purposes, for getting access to other public assistance, as well as determining what you need in order to restart school. So that would also go into your after portion of your annex. So you're likely going to want to have an annex addressing some of these critical assets. Now, I believe that our presenters might have some experience about some strategies that they can offer, perhaps, about how to protect them, or some items that they didn't realize were such assets until afterwards. Mike or Kristen and Amy?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and check. And just a reminder, I was a counselor, and so I was not keeping good inventory of my items before the tornado, and felt pretty desperate afterwards just to remember what I needed and what I used. You know, with trauma, you have a little bit of short-term memory loss, and so I actually highly recommend keeping a current inventory and keeping it handy and just kind of being more aware as you add things throughout the year. Just don't do it at the beginning and the end of school years, but to keep it up to date, because you do have things throughout the year that you would need to remember.
And this is Amy. I was a principal, and one of the things that I found through the people who want to donate is sometimes they don't know what to donate. So if you have an idea, for instance, the library was a total loss, that might be something that you ask for, is donations of books. And then have somebody who can catalog those for you as they come in, so that when you do get your new space or the library is able to house books again, you have that inventory in place.
I'm just going to jump in real quickly as well. So the topic of continuity of operations planning, or COOP planning, the REMCA Center, we offer a variety of materials in a variety of different formats on COOP. So those include a fact sheet, a resource list, online course, webinars, and a specialized training package, which includes PowerPoint. So those, you can definitely reach out to those if you need specific links to those, but you should be able to access most of those resources via the web links box on your screen. So for example, the webinars and the specialized training packages. So we do offer quite a few resources on continuity of operations planning. And then if you do have any specific questions about COOP, you can always reach out to us, and we'll provide a detailed response. So I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And Mike, this one's directed at you. So as somebody from the state level, what advice do you have for schools who want to work with state agencies on recovery?
You know, Paul, that's one of those, it's almost, I hate to say it's one of those things we almost assume is being done, but it's one of those pieces of the action that we really speak to very specifically when talking to districts and schools. It's part of the COOP planning, part of your emergency operations planning, to know physically where you sit, who do you talk to, who do you contact at your local level with your local jurisdictions, your local administrators, your local city, county, whatever. Move it up the scale. I mentioned counties, but who do you contact in the county? Who is the right person to go to for what? Move it up to the state level. Who are the agencies that deal with those things that you need help with? whether it's funding, whether it's National Guard, you name it. How do you approach then the federal level if it's something that's really you've experienced a real disaster? And how do you move up the steps from that local police chief, local mayor, administrator, up to the governor, up to FEMA and the national level? Build that in. Understand not just this is a good idea, but put names to it. Identify those people at the different levels, and who do you go to, and what forms, literally, what, PS 272, what form number do you need to have and to fill out to get things moving forward? So rather than just be a general, it's a good idea to do this, lay it out, set it out, put the pieces, put the paperwork, put the names, put the contact information right there in your plan. So if in the event you need to do this, you have those contact informations and the forms to start with and so forth. Get the people as much as possible to sit down at the table up front before anything happens, so that when you call or when somebody calls you, you have a name and a face that go together, and you can actually have that communication, and they understand where you are, where you sit, what you need, and when you're saying, I need this, they understand that you need that.
Great, thank you, Mike. And thank you to those who posed the questions today, and a special thanks obviously goes to our presenters today, Mike, Kristen, and Amy. If you'd like to contact any of them, you can email the TA Center, and we will forward the request to the appropriate person. The TA Center also has resources related to the topics discussed by today's presenters, some of which we want to highlight. The latest approach of the TA Center is to create a suite of resources on specific topics, obviously things like recovery and COOP, which we've mentioned. Also other topics such as resiliency strategy for caregivers, and also meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities or access and functional needs. And as I mentioned earlier, there are resources that are available in a variety of formats, and we suggest you check out some of the web links which are displayed in the box on your screen. We also encourage you to visit the TA Center website for additional information about TA Center resources, including the school guide. We're now going to move into the final part of the event, where participants will have the opportunity to continue the conversation in the TA Center's community of practice. We've started a new forum on our community of practice called Recovery Web Chat to discuss this topic in more detail. We encourage you to post questions to the REMS team or your colleagues, or to share resources. To access the forum, log into the community of practice, and the login button is available at the top of our website and also in the web links box on your screen. Once you've logged in, click the K-12 public forums and then Recovery Web Chat. If you have any issues accessing the forum, feel free to email us at info@remstacenter.org. We'll be live on the community of practice, or COP, for about 30 minutes to answer any additional questions you have and to hear any additional insight that you have to share about emergency preparedness. Thank you for your time today, and this concludes the webinar.